Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Maddie, for having me on to chat about this. Um, so the book, it has a kind of an unusual origin. The book started as and I'll probably repeat some of this. It started as an interview with Peter Rowan, who's a bluegrass musician. I do music interviews, music articles for various magazines. However, when I was speaking to Peter, there's something different about him. He's a cosmic cowboy. He's the kind of alchemist of bluegrass, and he's known for being that. Um, One thing is, where does Buddhism and bluegrass mix? I consider myself kind of like a Barnes and Noble's Buddhist. I'm a bad Buddhist, but I am very interested in the metaphysics, the ideas. It's probably the practice that I most connect and relate to. Um, when I was doing the article for Peter, who's had a 60-year plus ish career. I mean, that's a pretty long career, starting out as a bluegrass player and then kind of moving into different genres. He's a kind of cultural ambassador. Um, One of the things I noticed is that there's a kind of arc of spiritual discovery in his catalog of music. And this was really gripping me as I was, contemplating the article. And what I said to him is, would you be interested in working on a longer piece? This could be a feature article, it could be a book. I don't know. I can't promise. I don't know what will come of it. He agreed to it. Um, One thing I should say is he has an album. If you're familiar with Robert Plant and Alison Krauss did an album called Rising Sand, and it's kind of, I would call it in the Americana tradition. And he did an album, Peter Rowan did an album called Dharma Blues. And these are all very, very, they're very specifically Buddhist influenced songs, Buddhist lyrics, Buddhist meditations, contemplations. And I would say there are bluegrass elements in those songs, but they're largely Americana. So I was seeing this connection, and I think Peter and I had that connection of we were interested in Buddhism, interested in spirituality, interested in metaphysics. We're both very interested in indigenous American, Native American culture. And these things, to put it in a cliche way, were kind of blowing my mind. And I was seeing these connections. And I should also add that bluegrass, it comes from, it was created by Bill Monroe. He, I think you can say that he can be attributed to creating bluegrass. He himself would tell you that I created bluegrass. Um, but he did create something different. He took kind of a hybrid of country music, of blues, of gospel music, and made it faster, there's an emphasis on the virtuosity of the musician. But just going back to the gospel part, so there's a lot of spiritualism in bluegrass. So it may be Christian spiritual, but the music is really designed to take you away. It's gospel music with those three-part harmonies. They're ethereal, it's angelic, and they're also at a very high register. And so I was seeing these things kind of connect, um, and I think fans of Peter Rowan would say, yeah, of course, he's he's the Tao of bluegrass. He brings that together, the rudiments of bluegrass, but also in this spiritual, very thoughtful, I would say even, pan-religious way, looking across different spiritual domains. If I may add one thing just to it, I just before you started taping, we were in York, and we went to the York Cathedral, and we went to two, was we were only there a few days, maybe four. We went to Evensong uh, at 5:30, which is beautiful spiritual music. And I'd say not unlike, it's their harmonies. People, what was kind of beautiful is the choral group walked in past us, and each were singing in a different harmony part. And you had tall people, short people, older people, young people, different voices, all this panoply of voices coming. It was breathtaking, not to mention the service as well. But, I would argue that all music is spiritual. Um, but specifically for the purposes of this book, I was seeing the connections between Peter's exploration, frankly, my exploration of meditation, of the practices of Buddhism, the practice of emptiness, which, if you read the book, you learn a lot more about it. A reviewer wrote about the book that it was like a devotional prayer book, which I thought that was I'm glad they said that. So this book, I think, is an introduction to both. And it consists of nuggets so Bill Monroe would kind of offer these interesting anecdotes about bluegrass, as well as Peter does as well. Peter is a kind of the keeper of the lore, the folklore, the knowledge of bluegrass, and he has great stories to tell. And so I captured those stories, and I did try to connect them up with, in a sense, parallel them with things that I had been reading, because as I was writing the book, I was also doing a lot of reading of different religious texts, like the Rig Veda, the mythological texts like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. And I was striving to make this a kind of compendium, in a sense. So there's a personal story. There's kind of my engagement and discovery of the depth and breadth of Peter Rowan's vast career, connecting it up with different traditions, spiritual and metaphysical traditions. We were just talking about before we started taping, Aldous Huxley, he wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. And The Perennial Philosophy will have quotes from, some of the texts I just mentioned, also Christian texts, and kind of putting them, it's arranged thematically, but putting them side by side. And then there's Aldous Huxley's commentary on them. And in a way, that's kind of what I was striving for. What I would say to people is, this is a good book to make an introduction. I've had people say, well, I read your book and I'm interested in bluegrass now. I'm checking out bluegrass. I'm checking out Peter Rowan. I'm checking out other earlier bluegrass players. So I would say it's a good way to get an introduction, to get some of the folklore, and then to point you into a direction to then do more reading, to do more discovery. Because what I'm talking about here is there are nuggets, but you can go very deep in all of this subject matter. And that's typically what I do is when I'm, for instance, listening to Led Zeppelin, if you listen to Led Zeppelin, if you're very curious, you dig deeper, and what were they listening to? What were they turned on? Robert Johnson, the Delta players, they were turned on by, of course, British guitar players, like Bert Jansch, John Renbourn. And so I hope that this book is, and it is a very unconventional book. I realize that because it goes from interview to kind of dream-like passages to biographical parts. So it engages the reader on different levels. But I would hope that people would take this book and then go and dig deeper. And that would be, I'd feel like mission accomplished. So I'd say this book was a little different, I think for different writing, for different books, I've had different approaches. There's a Russian expression, you have to have a good ass to be a writer. And that means you have to sit down and do the work. I think largely, inspiration comes from perspiration. You have to sit down and do the work, and then there's discovery that happens. That is often the case. There have been times there's been a bolt of lightning that just came across, and I had to write something down. I couldn't write fast enough. So that does happen too, where it's my hands are moving slower than my mind is trying to get information to them. Um, so I've now I type instead of write, with a pen. This book was a little different in that, when you're meeting someone who's an icon. Now, Peter is a very regular, good guy. He's a father. Uh, he's a nice man. Um, and he's lives, I'm sure, a very regular life, when he's not on tour and when he's not playing. But when you meet someone who is a pillar, is an icon, that can have, I told Peter he put a spell on me because, we were texting and we were emailing back and forth as the book really began to get going. And he was triggering things in me. Like, I started to have dreams, and I was having dreams that involved him. And, some of that I think was being porous and just open to whatever inspiration. But I think specifically, because it was him, and I've been listening to his music since I'm a teenager. So it has a very specific meaning to me. And suddenly now, when you're on the phone with someone whose voice you've heard in music, music goes deep. Music, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, I think. Music touches you in ways that language just doesn't. Maybe poetry can. Um, I forget who said it, but all art uh, aspires to the condition of music. So music can just kind of, it goes deeper in the levels of your consciousness, I think. And along with that is, an icon of music that inspired you, that was a part of your formative experience. And so I think this book had a different process, is really what I'm trying to say, that I kind of wrestled with it. It was this, it wasn't that I sat down and just wrote and the perspiration created the inspiration. I was inspired. I was, sort of possessed, you might say. Um, Screaming Jay Hawkins, you put a spell on me, is kind of the thing. I think there were synchronicities too that were exciting to me and interesting. So, for instance, I have a book called Falling from Trees, and uh, Peter wrote a poem, and I told him about that book. He has a poem called Falling from the Trees. So there was these little interesting synchronicities that were kind of lighting a fire and lighting my imagination, and I was just letting it take me wherever it would go. This is an important part, I should say. So a friend of mine is an artist, and I often hang out with him. He has a roof. I live in Brooklyn, and he has a studio where he does mosaics. He does mosaics made of found stuff, porcelain, glass, and they do these murals, and in the streets. They'll do it for stores. They'll make these beautiful symbols and images that they're hired to create. But he also creates these portraits of famous personages, or sometimes there's a theme, and I'll explain that. He'll cut out New York City MTA subway cards. So if you've ever seen them, maybe you haven't, but they're orange-ish, I guess, and black. And then he'll use those cutout bits to then create a portrait, which is amazing to map someone's, coloration and just their face. And he's especially good at creating the eyes and creating there's a living soul behind these portraits. So there was a portrait kind of hidden um, in the stack of portraits he had, and one of them was this guy Ernie Panicoli. Ernie Panicoli is hip hop photographer, and he won great acclaim photographing, and they trusted him. He's from Brooklyn, and he was, rap guys felt, I think, simpatico to him, and he was respectful and understood where they came from. Ernie is half Cree, so Native American, and half Italian. When I saw that portrait, it kind of started something. I interviewed Ernie for an article for a newspaper. I'd been writing a series of interviews with indigenous artists. So then Ernie introduced me to this woman, Yungchin Lamo, who's a Tibetan singer who lives in upstate New York. I interviewed her for an article, and I had read that she played with Peter Rowan. And then she introduced me to Peter. Now, the reason I say this is this improbable series of connections from me looking at a portrait that was kind of hidden in the back there to meeting someone, who's important in my personal history, and not just mine, many people my age and probably older too. So there was some magic, there was some pixie dust that was sprinkled, and I just had to chase it. I had to chase that rainbow down. And I say that in the book that I use this theme of these circular themes that we were, and I go into these like multiverse that, we are, Peter and I and Yungchin and Ernie and my friend Juan Carlos, who's the artist, that we're sort of following each other as we move through different, multiverses and kind of interconnect. And this happens over and over again in this eternal recurrence. And, some of that is just poetic, imaginings. It's not necessarily strict beliefs, but it just was occurring to me as I was writing it. It's a good question. My teenage self probably wouldn't listen to me. So that's one of the issues there. I don't know if you can relate. I come from a pretty modest background. I don't know. I think in England you also have projects. You have a sort of subsidized housing kind of thing. So, I think our experience, the folks that I grew up with, my friends that I grew up with, it was a non-standard experience. We was kind of underprivileged, I would say. That being said, I look at that younger person and I think, first of all, he had great taste in music. We were listening to Frank Zappa and Old and in the Way, Peter's group. Yes, the Grateful Dead. I hadn't really, at that point as a teenager, I hadn't really branched out into jazz and other, classical and international music. But I still listen to this music today. I'm still fascinated, and I learn more about the music that I was listening to as a teenager. And I kind of say, this kid had good aesthetic taste. He might have been a troubled kid. He could have used some help. I probably would have said to him, I mean, he was fearless. I talk like he's a different person because on some levels he is. I'm not fearless anymore. I'm definitely not. I had a couple of lucky breaks that I, did the college tests and did well on it, and it just kind of propelled me into a different place. Maybe what I would say is to that younger guy is I would say, button yourself up a bit and pay more attention and focus. I think I eventually did, but I would say that I meandered to that point. That being said, though, there would be probably a book and a half that I wouldn't have written had I been kind of, buttoned up and straight and narrow. So it's really hard to say what I would say. I think now I'm a good student. Now I sit at the feet of the teacher. I wish I could have done a little bit more of that as a teenager, to just be completely open. I thought I knew it all, is really what it comes down to. Now I know you learn more by listening and shutting up and being open to what someone has to say. I mean, you still have to be selective to someone's input, but maybe if there's a way that I could package that to my teenage self to convince that person to listen, man, that'd be awesome. So it's a great question. I think we touched on some of that. I think, music can touch us in a way that language cannot. And I do talk about that in the book. We talked about, Peter and I, some of the questions that I asked him. He said, "Am I answering your question?" And I said, "Well, there really is no answer." But we were talking about the origins of music. So, for instance, birdsong. They say that birdsong is something that humans can hear the farthest distance away. It's like evolutionary, it's a benefit to us to be able to hear birdsong. Why? Where there are birds, there are probably water, there's probably trees, there are probably other animals. And there's something in us that um, that draws us to music and that lures us to music. Um, think of our greatest moments in life, weddings, funerals, uh, parties. Music accompanies those events. And it music can do things to us that I know for me, and I know this is true for most people, can make us cry. I mean, I could sit here at night on a Friday night and just have tears running down my eyes. Could be the whiskey too sometimes, or laugh, sometimes cry and laugh at the same time. It can make you nostalgic. You come home and you're listening to, when you're cleaning the house, you put on like music that gets you, stepped up. But as I said, I was at York and York Cathedral, York Minster, and it just completely moved by that. I like church music. I love Palestrina. I love Bach. Um, I can be carried away by those things. Um, I think music is not yet understood well enough. I think on the power and the transformative nature that music has on human beings, and it's why we're drawn to it. You when you hear bluegrass, you hear the pace of it, and you start tapping your foot, and you get up and you start dancing, and it makes you move. Rock and roll, uh, punk, move in a different way. But I think music is um, the key to understanding. One of the keys to understanding human consciousness is bound up with understanding music and its origins and its uh, potency and ability to change our mood, to change our lives, to transform us. And that's not always for the better, by the way. So these things can be used. My ex-wife is from the former Soviet Union, and they had songs that they memorized by rote. And these were kind of nationalist songs to imprint the philosophies or, the authoritarianism. So it's deep and powerful, and we have to be careful about that as well, I think. You go to a concert, I mean, you have 40,000 people, and they're gripped. It's like one organism, um, gripped by this music, this band. And it also depends on the kind of music, but it can just silence a whole sea of people and really hit them deep in the heart, or it could get you up on your feet, kind of flicking your lighter and, whatever it is people might do at a concert. So yeah, I think I'm very interested and I explore that in this book. So I explore theoretical, not as a scientist, more as a poet, as someone curious, the origins of music, the bird origins. There's a section where I go into. I've been reading books by shoot, I can't remember her name right now, but she's written these wonderful books on birds, and and she's like, she's a poet. It's not there, it's scientific, but she can write about it in a very poetic way. I was very inspired, and that's in the book too.